Hello everyone, thank you for joining me for this webinar on representing parents with learning difficulties in care proceedings. We will cover both learning difficulties and learning disabilities in this particular seminar. My name is Regan Persaud. I'm a barrister at Spire Barristers in Leeds, and I have a special interest in working with parents with learning difficulties and disabilities, so this is my area of expertise. Let's move into it. I hope that you have had not only these slides, but also the handout that comes with this. And whilst in this webinar, I will cover the material in overview form, the handout is very detailed, takes matters much further. And this is just to give you the introduction really to the handout. And I would encourage you, A, to follow this webinar using the handout, and B, to read the wider information that expands on everything I will discuss in more detail within the handout. So what we will cover today, we're going to explore the kinds of limitations that parents with learning difficulties and disabilities can face. We're going to learn about what the law says about actually when matters come to court in care proceedings. How should the court, how should the professionals working with these people be responding and adjusting to their needs? We're going to make sure that we look at what is typically done in care proceedings and actually what should best practice be, because there is still, I would say, a little bit of learning to be done there. And we're going to explore how you can challenge in care proceedings the types of assessments and the way that parents with learning difficulties and disabilities are treated to make sure that they ultimately have a fair hearing. I think it's important when we start to really get a sense of what I mean though when I say learning difficulties and learning disabilities. Remember that the NHS website specifically defines a learning disability as something that affects the way that a person learns new things throughout their life. It can be different for everyone, so no two people are the same. And we know that it can be invisible, so it's not something you would know necessarily when you obviously speak to someone. We know that the learning disability or the learning difficulty can mean that they struggle to understand information, particularly complicated information, that it can affect how they learn certain skills, and it can affect how they look after themselves, including whether they can look after a child or how they can look after themselves if they live on their own. This isn't necessarily a large group of people. The people who are affected and who have learning disabilities, it's around 2.16 of the population that have learning disabilities, but that number increases when we include people who suffer from learning difficulties as part of that. And of course, we know that often people can develop learning difficulties, even if they would otherwise not have those as a result of a poor educational background or trauma themselves in their own childhood. Sadly, anyone who practices in care will know that we see maybe a disproportionately high number of people with learning difficulties and learning disabilities ending up in care proceedings, sadly because of the difficulties that they face and particularly because of their vulnerabilities as individuals. As a lawyer, what I would advise you to do then is when you will work with clients, just be very open-minded about the fact that these sort of difficulties can be invisible. It might be that we need to look at medical records, school records, get an overview of their background before we can actually start to think, hang on a minute, might there be some issues here that we have to explore in further detail? Please also bear in mind though that these parents, even if you speak to them about it, they can feel quite embarrassed about having learning difficulties and disabilities. Often being limited in school, not being able to grasp things as quickly as your peers will mean that many of these people will have been bullied in their childhoods. The stigma that follows having learning difficulties and disabilities, sadly, it still continues to this day, and a lot of them will have been called really cruel names. I mean, we've all heard of people being called retard and mong, and they're awful words that mean that when these parents will come to work with you, they may be embarrassed, they may be shy, they may even be defensive about wanting to admit that they have these difficulties and about and it may affect whether they are willing to accept support around these issues. So we have to be empathetic, we have to understand those issues, and we have to reassure them that there is support out there that can be provided for them, particularly because under the Equality Act 2010 even, having a learning disability is a protected characteristic. It means that you shouldn't be discriminated against. And if a local authority is found to act in a way where they are not making reasonable adjustments in that regard, then there could be a claim by that parent against the authority. Remember finally that Many learning difficulties and disabilities can also go undiagnosed. As I say, it's not obvious, which makes it more difficult to diagnose. And I particularly always flag to professionals at this stage the issue of autism. Autism in many people can go undiagnosed, and autism in particular in women can go undiagnosed. New research has shown that many women who have autism have been undiagnosed, which perhaps is part and parcel of the difficulties we see today in the NHS generally. But it does mean that when you will come to work with these individuals, they may have issues that need to be explored during the course of proceedings. A cognitive assessment is the obvious and the one that we will most likely turn to. And likewise, even at times, depending on the severity of the limitation, we might look to capacity assessments if you have concerns about capacity to litigate. Capacity and capacity assessments and litigating in proceedings could be a seminar in itself, so I won't necessarily go further than that. But if further information is required on that, please do reach out to me. I would say, though, that in addition to cognitive and capacity assessments, I would invite practitioners to think more about autism assessments, ADHD assessments, especially when you will have parents accused of behaving in a certain way, making certain comments, that showing a lack of regard for a child's emotional needs, that showing an unwillingness to adapt. Those are issues if there is a hint of autism or ADHD on the papers. Those are issues which may well be accounted for as a result of that parent's difficulties. And it would certainly provide an explanation as to why they say certain things to mean that actually there might not be anything sinister in this. It might just be the way they think. And having clarity as to whether or not they have autism, in particular, might end up opening a door for support from them, from adult services, rather than it being used as a whip against them through pleadings and threshold, because that hasn't been properly clarified. So certainly something that we need to think about when we meet these parents, and think about the way we would approach them, the way we would adapt to them, the way we would reassure them that they don't have to worry about their particular limitations and stigma attached to that. And it would also affect the way we think about the case generally in terms of planning for assessments. Let's move on to that in more detail then, to give you a sense of that. What is typically done in care proceedings? Well, the obvious thing that's done, and it tends to be wheeled out, is PAMS assessments. The minute a local authority sees that there's a parent with a learning difficulty or disability, they turn to PAMS and feel that PAMS is the approach to be taken and the type of assessment to be completed. We now know, though, that PAMS is considered outdated. PAMS was created in 1998, for those of you who don't know. So 98 might feel like not so long ago. I know certainly for me it doesn't feel that long ago, but the reality is it is a long time ago. And it was before we had instant Wi-Fi. It was before we had tools like TikTok and videos accessible on phones. It was before we had YouTube to show different slides on different videos. It was before a wealth of information was far more accessible to parents with learning difficulties and disabilities, which can aid their learning. PAMS was designed at a time before all of that. PAMS was designed